To the Rector of the University of Yangon, Professor Pho Kaung, to you esteemed students of this wonderful university, to my colleagues from the United Nations team, a good afternoon to you, Mingla Ba. It's a pleasure to be here in Yangon and to be in Myanmar. And as your rector just alluded to, until a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of leading the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford. And I'm very happy that I am able, as part of my first visit to one of our program countries, to be back in a university where I have spent the last year leading teams that are researching on the great challenges of the 21st century. And in some ways, the great challenges of the 21st century can often be interpreted as being ones of science and technology, but actually more often than not, they are about the relationship between science and technology, humanity, society, and our environment. And that was in part my decision at the time to try and take my experience into a university and a research environment that would allow me to combine the best of both worlds. So today I am here at the University of Yangon, and I am very excited because in speaking to you, I hope I can convey some of the great aspirations that we all have associated with the decision by the member states of the United Nations to adopt the Agenda 2030, as it is called, and the Sustainable Development Goals, with many targets and indicators that we are in a first step measuring our progress towards the year 2030. I'm also very honored to do this in a university which stands for the vision and the ambition of knowledge informing our societies and of training you as future leaders of your nation, of your communities, just as the university has, as you alluded to, had many famous graduates in the past, among them General Aung San, its first Prime Minister, U Nu, and also a UN Secretary General, U Thant, all graduates of this university here. So when I come and speak to you today about the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations, not just in terms of the organization, but the nations of the world united behind one vision for development that applies to all countries. That is why we call it the Universal Goals. It's the first time in history that all nations have agreed that they are bound together by the decisions that they will make about development, whether they are wealthy nations, poorer nations, large nations, small nations, industrialized nations, agriculturally based economies. We are bound together at the beginning of the 21st century by an appreciation of the fact that the decisions that are taken in one part of the world will affect the lives of people in another part of the world. That is why they are global goals, but also they are intergenerational, because decisions that we take today as people who have the power to decide, to build, to destroy, to invent new technologies, our decisions will also be of consequence to future generations. And many of you, I'm sure, look at this issue, for example, through the lens of climate change. The inaction of the current generation will create irreversible realities for future generations. And perhaps in 50 years' time, historians will write about our generation and ask, how could we not have acted faster? How could we not have taken more drastic actions? Because in 50 to 100 years' time, our ability to reverse these developments will no longer exist. This is the drama of the 21st century when we talk about development. But let me turn for a moment to also the context of Myanmar. I asked to come and visit you, to speak to you not only about Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals in a global sense. I want to bring them also closer to you, because I believe that in their approach to thinking about development, in the framework that it provides to every one of us in making choices, it could prove to be extremely relevant also to what happens next in Myanmar. Your country is in the midst of a triple transition, from war to peace, from military rule to democracy, and also from a closed to an open economy. And these are just three phenomena of transition, but they are profound, they are deep, they are challenging, and no one can predict with great certainty what each one will produce into the future. Because what happens next is a matter of so many different choices that need to be made by many different actors in a society. Myanmar is a proud nation, rich in history, wealthy in resources, but also challenged by poverty and livelihoods and human development indicators. Indeed, amongst ASEAN nations, this proud nation today, in terms of some of these economic indicators, comes at the lower end of the spectrum. And yet Myanmar in recent years has seen remarkable growth, economic growth, growth in GDP, the measure that we use so much around the world to assess progress in our economies. Growth in 2017 is expected to exceed 7%. This is amongst the highest of all economies in the world. So in some ways you could say, isn't everything going to be all right? Because actually we are growing very fast. But what the SDGs tell us, and what the story of sustainable development also tells us over the last 50 to 100 years, is a more complex story, and also the reason why the world in the year 2015 decided to come together in New York and adopt a new agenda and these Sustainable Development Goals. Because the story of modern accelerated economic development has shown us that very often focusing only on GDP growth and looking at the indicators in aggregate terms, per capita incomes, may indicate a great deal of progress, but it can also mask or hide many phenomena that ultimately can challenge not only the economic success, but actually destroy societies. The lessons of the last 10 years, not only in terms of the financial crisis, but also in terms of the political upheaval that we have seen in many parts of the world, has taught us something vitally important. Economic progress, measured in terms of GDP growth alone, may sometimes not show up where societies will ultimately reject that development path. Because very often when you have high economic rates of growth, inequality also grows. GDP growth that is driven principally by, let's say, urban development, large-scale infrastructure investment, and foreign direct investment at large company scale may indeed register very positively in the national accounts, your income statistics. But when we look deeper, it is very concentrated in a very few places usually that this development takes place. It also affects only some people, and often, particularly in rural economies, leaves the majority of people outside that modern economy. It can create income differentials because some people's income goes up very quickly while the majority stays at the same level. This is what we call vertical inequality. But even more risky is what we have come to know as horizontal inequality. which essentially describes the inequality amongst groups in a nation. And what we have also learned in history is that inequality centered around different groups, be they ethnic or regional, can be a very dangerous thing in a society, because it begins to create tensions, and those tensions are often exploited politically, and very quickly we actually can see nations go into conflict. So inequality is a key consideration, or put positively, development with equity is fundamental to long-term success. The other Achilles heel, if you want, that we have learned about over the last 50 to 100 years is related to the phenomenon of unsustainability. Few of us can imagine a world where only 1 billion people lived, and yet this is only 300 years ago. Less than 300 years ago, on the entire planet Earth, there was only 1 billion people. So the entire geological history of this planet until about 1700 and something, let's say 1750s, allowed 1 billion people to live on this planet. Today, the next billion people will be added to the global population in just the next 30 to 40 years. That alone gives you a sense of the dramatic increase in people on this planet, and therefore also in the consumption footprint that is required to sustain us, not just in basic needs, but sustain us in our growing footprint with more energy consumption, more meat consumption, because as we become wealthier, we also increase our footprint of consumption. It was one of the more unusual things that at the beginning of the 21st century, at the peak, if you want, of a history of invention, of technology, of science, and of wealth, we suddenly found ourselves, through the phenomenon of climate change, reminded how vulnerable we actually were and how much we depended on life's or Earth's life support systems, our atmosphere, our biosphere, our ecosystems, our marine ecosystems, not just terrestrial, forests, watersheds, land, soil, all these, the ecological wealth of our planet, seem to be something that we could replace with technology and science, buy with money what nature used to provide us, because it would be found in a shop or at the end of a bank account or an ATM. Climate change reminded us that in fact our collective capacity to threaten the future of humanity by destroying nature and those life support systems was actually at the beginning of the 21st century not a remote and distant threat from the past, but an ever more dramatic threat for the future. And so economic development, which for a long time treated nature and the ecological services, nature services to humanity, if you want, as essentially free, zero price, losing a forest, losing a river basin, having a hole in the ozone layer, having pollution and carbon dioxide emissions, was not a price for development, it was essentially a zero price for development. This is how economics and our economies treated environmental change. It is only when we began to realize that actually you cannot, with money or with technology, replace the ozone layer. You cannot contain global warming if you continue to emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases which accumulate in the atmosphere and then trap heat, which begins to change life on Earth as we know it. That there was no easy way to buy your way out of this, even if Elon Musk and others are now dreaming about using rockets to take us to other planets to live there. But it's a risky proposition that his rockets will transport enough people before it gets too hot on planet Earth. So, in looking at the future, the challenge of unsustainable development, of economic growth, hiding the true cost of what it actually takes to produce a kilogram of meat, or move a vehicle for 1 or 100 miles in terms of petrol and emissions, not to mention air pollution and air quality, is only just beginning to register in our economies. And so the Sustainable Development Goals are today 17 areas through which we look at development that takes the human ambition of well-being, of health, but also of opportunity, of incomes, of education, and the development of our economies in terms of industrialization, in terms of access to energy, and then life on planet Earth, life on land, life in the oceans, as centerpieces of trying to think about the development of both humanity, but now principally by looking at Sustainable Development Goals at the national level. And this is where, in my lecture today, I would like to dwell for a moment on why it is that at this moment in time, in the history of Myanmar, looking at development and the future of your country through this Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals is such a relevant opportunity. To do so, I don't want to take you through the 17 goals one by one. And I would even say to you, since you are all by now media savvy, social networkers, and no doubt users of the latest technology, treat for a moment the Sustainable Development Goals as the operating system of sustainable development. If you have, a smartphone or a telephone, the operating system is something that none of us fully understand. We did not design it, and we cannot repair it even. But what we do is we press a button and then we use it. Apps appear. The challenge of using the Sustainable Development Goals, and where I look also to you as students, is that you are the people who can develop the applications that can run on the operating system called the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is the Myanmar applications. It is the apps that allow the issues and the problems of today around you to be addressed through the Sustainable Development Goals. It is to provide the platforms on which you can debate whether inequality is something that you consider to be acceptable, the price of development, or whether equitable development for all communities across the country should be a central part of planning development and thinking about it. You can also use it to look at how do we trade off development in terms of infrastructure with loss of forests, of nature, of biodiversity. Myanmar is a nation that has an extensive coastline where fisheries are an integral part not only of its own population and of your national diet, it's also a major economic asset. How will marine resources be managed to support national development? How will your energy systems be built in the future to minimize the damage to the environment and to people's health and to maximize the benefits? And how can we make sure that development is not only planned through the eyes of those who have access to knowledge, to university, to being in government offices? Because one very fundamental principle in Agenda 2030 is to leave no one behind. Now you might say, that sounds very nice, but what does it mean? Well, it puts into contrast a very fundamental principle, because for much of the 20th century, development was defined as if leaving people behind was a natural price to pay. The rich had to get richer first, and then sooner or later development would trickle down. That was the theory, in a very simplified way, of modern development thinking. But as I pointed out at the beginning, towards the end of the 20th century, we learned that too many people left behind will not accept the economy that is being planned for them and in their name. They start protesting, they start rebelling, they start overthrowing governments, they start voting for extremist positions in their country. Social cohesion is lost. So when we talk about the principle of leaving no one behind, it is actually a very powerful statement to say that planning our development in the future cannot be based on having the majority of our people remaining behind at extreme poverty levels, where also amongst ethnic communities and in remote areas, the ability to participate in nation building is lost. Our work in the United Nations with our sister agencies who work here in Myanmar today is increasingly centered around trying to assist Myanmar to look at the future of its development through the Sustainable Development Goals perspective, taking national priorities, but also trying to embed them in a larger framework for development. Sustainable development implies many things, and I just want to give you a few examples. One, and the first one is one that hopefully a number of you will already be contributing to while you're here at university, which is to invest in data and evidence. If we do not know who the poor are, if we do not know where the poor live, if we do not know what is the main reason why people are poor, then how can development eradicate poverty? The ability to study and to learn and to also see, because often the poor people remain invisible to those who make decisions about development, is critical. It is part of why we in the UN are working with the Central Statistical Organization in Myanmar to strengthen the ability of data. Why one of our agencies, UNFPA, has been working with the government on a national census, and why the World Bank and the UN and UNDP are also working on another major project to look at livelihoods and incomes across the country. These are contributions to helping decision-making in Myanmar to better target where investments in development are needed and what kind of investments are needed. And I don't need to tell you that given the painful history of conflict and war, it is also a critical part of being able to target investments for peace building. Because harmony and community best thrives when people feel included and not left out. And so much of what the government and the National Reconciliation and Peace Commission are also looking at today is how can development be part of building the peace and the harmony in the nation as a whole. A second area is about how we can particularly look at investments in prevention, and also particularly in the context of the risks that Myanmar faces, for instance, from climate change, from extreme weather events, the fragility of its people, its economy and its communities is inextricably linked also to a degree of preparedness for how you deal with those risks. The tragedy of Cyclone Nargis and the extraordinary pain and grief that Myanmar suffered when so many people died at that time should never be forgotten. Not everyone could have been saved, that much is clear. But we have learned with many countries across the world that disaster risk preparedness, understanding where the risks will come from, training people, putting early warning systems in place, are fundamental to protecting life and to minimizing the damage that natural disasters can cause. We cannot stop cyclones. We can certainly act to not create more extreme weather events if we address the challenge of climate change. But even now, we can already act to protect communities, people, infrastructure through better disaster risk preparedness. And so our participation as the UN family in helping the government to identify priority areas, priority actions, and also to create investment in capacity building is a part of our contribution. But again, Rector, I also look to the university as being part of building that capacity, because this is not only a matter of infrastructure and technology, it is awareness, it is ingenuity, it is creativity to adapt methodologies for national disaster risk preparedness. Another area in which we are increasingly engaged with different parts of both government and actors, and increasingly in the future also with the private sector, is how to foster an economic development that also builds a greener economy. An economy that recognizes what I described earlier on, that the price of destroying nature is not zero. In fact, the price of destroying nature is getting higher every day. And some of you may have heard of Lord Nicholas Stern, who about 10 years ago published a report about the economics of climate change, in which he documented many different phenomena, but the most powerful one was actually that the cost of inaction, i.e. the cost of not acting on climate change, had surpassed the cost of acting. So looking into the future, he said, it will become so expensive to deal with the consequences of global warming that it pays to invest today in avoiding it. In the 10 years since, we have seen extraordinary things happen. And in fact, the story gets better. That very often investing in things that would reduce global warming are actually good for our economies and good for our people. Worldwide, investments in renewable energy technology in the last 3 years have now exceeded the combined total investment in new infrastructure for oil, gas, coal, and nuclear put together. That means in just 15 years, our energy economy is essentially being turned upside down. And by renewable energy technology, I do not mean large dams. They are not even included. It is solar technology, wind power, and geothermal power. Those three now generate over $300 billion in annual investments in new electricity producing infrastructure. It creates more jobs. It is also suitable for many developing countries because the price has come down so much that in South Africa now it is cheaper to produce a kilowatt hour of solar and wind power than of coal. 10 years ago, South Africa said, this will never be the case. We have the cheapest coal on the planet and we cannot afford to invest in solar and wind. Today, South Africa is actually looking at how it can change the entire energy economy in order to maximize the production of solar and wind power. It's an example of what I mean by also looking at the SDGs from the perspective of multiple benefits, because not only does it allow a nation like Myanmar to begin to create electricity and power generation off-grid in many of the decentralized areas of the country, because you don't need a centralized power station and then to build hundreds or thousands of kilometers of power lines before you can connect people. No, you can make decentralized power production. The added benefit of clean energy is another one which falls under a completely different sustainable development goal. healthier people. As I said earlier on, pollution is today amongst the biggest killers in the world of people. The World Health Organization, part of our UN family, estimates premature deaths, i.e. people who die earlier than they would have done naturally due to air quality, indoor and outdoor air pollution, at roughly 7 million people every year. So the Sustainable Development Goals are not only about single issues, it's also about combining the benefits of many different actions. And that is why we advocate a number of principles, and I'll only mention a few just now. In thinking about development in the future, the SDGs take an integrated approach. None of these goals are standalone goals. The economic, the social, the environmental can only succeed if they are addressed together. And that notion that economic development alone will bring happiness, prosperity, and success for all forever will not hold unless you can deal also with the social and the environmental. Secondly, that notion of leaving no one behind. Keeping our nations together, our communities to strive for development in partnership rather than in competition. To avoid that we divide ourselves by groups, whether by ethnicity, by religion, or by geography, in part depends on fair development. Just like our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is calling for fair globalization. Globalization has become a very controversial term in recent years. It's in part because globalization has benefited some a great deal. It has helped many, but what it has left us with is also a much more unequal world. And therefore, fair globalization and fair development at the national level does mean we pay attention. And we pay attention even to those who we may consider to be marginal to the next 10 years of development. And the imperative of risk-informed development. If you do not look at the future of development through the perspective of what are the risks to success, whether they are physical, economic, financial, or social, then we often risk being thrown back by years, if not decades. The financial crisis of 2008 not only cost us over $3,000 billion in money that essentially we, the public, had to find to cover the failure of banks and the financial system, it also threw back many countries, sometimes by a decade or more, in terms of loss of national wealth, of GDP, etc. Understanding those risks and acting on them is in part what Sustainable Development Goals also help us do. And I believe that the 12-point economic policy that the first democratically elected government has put at the center of its national development strategy actually speaks to these points. It highlights amongst them, not least, also Goal 16, where national reconciliation, peace building go alongside investment and improvement in economic and infrastructure conditions. Let me end my lecture this afternoon with you by speaking to you directly as what many would describe the next generation that will shape what happens in your country. Young people are both the most resourceful, entrepreneurial, adventurous group of people in our society. You have not only the ability to look back on the lessons of your fathers and mothers, of your forefathers, so to speak, on decisions that they have taken, you have your whole life ahead. In the United Nations Development Programme, we attach a great deal of importance in working with young people, because we believe that you are change agents. because we believe that you are also the generation that can take advantage of the latest knowledge and apply it to your neighborhood, to your community, to your business, to your life, wherever it may take you. In a nation such as Myanmar, where over half the population is under 30, that means there is a great deal of potential here. And I hope that as the University of Yangon begins to gather pace and expand and create opportunities for learning, it will also be at the forefront of enabling the next generation to take up leadership in the development of your country, but also in the responsibility that every citizen carries for achieving these sustainable development goals. They are part of keeping the human family together. They are a part of reminding us that development that leaves too many by the roadside threatens our collective well-being. That unsustainable development will not succeed. In fact, it will threaten us just as much, a young person in Myanmar, as a person in Australia, the United States, or Brazil in the future. And our work, not only as UNDP, but also with UNICEF in Myanmar and many other entities that work specifically to enable you to have a more active role in shaping the process of development, in informing the choices that government will take on your behalf, and also in helping you access the extraordinary knowledge base that the world today holds in terms of making better, wiser decisions, ultimately thrives in a university environment where you begin to see the horizons of a global family working together to achieve sustainable development in the 21st century. We in the United Nations have been proud partners to the people of Myanmar. In fact, UNDP and some agencies have been part of the journey of this nation for over 50 years, sometimes through troubled times, sometimes being rendered very passive in contributing to national development, at other times playing a very active role. And my visiting Myanmar as the first country in my tenure now as administrator of the United Nations Development Programme was also informed by the fact that here in Myanmar, so many things that will happen in the next few years will shape the destiny of a whole nation. The three transitions I referred to at the beginning are challenges, but they are also extraordinary opportunities. And I hope that in that partnership that we in the United Nations family have often brought to the history of Myanmar, we will also be able to contribute to the coming decades in the kind of development pathways and choices that you will make, that will unite this nation and that will elevate Myanmar from still being a country that on the indicators of human development is not in the top league to perhaps one of the great success stories of the next decade. Many of you may find yourselves in leadership positions here, or maybe even joining the United Nations. In fact, over the last 10 years, 400 people, young people from Myanmar, have joined the United Nations volunteers and have worked with us across the world. So let me also invite you, whether you join us directly by working with us, by being a volunteer with us, or whether you simply, as a result perhaps of my lecture here today, take a look at the Charter of the United Nations, begin to understand what it is that we stand for in the collective name of humanity, particularly of those who sometimes cannot speak up for themselves, who are not heard. I hope that you will be as excited by that vision and by that aspiration that the Charter of the United Nations stands for as all of us who are today privileged to work for it. Thank you very much.